You should see a notice that we are beginning to record. And again, thank you for coming.
Great. So Deb, thank you very much for your support and partnership on this. I'm Lori Ginevra-Cole. I'm president of the Vienna area branch of AAUW. This is one in a continuing series of programs that we've co-sponsored with the Patrick Henry Library. We're very pleased with our partnership with them and thank them very much for especially being here tonight when the library is technically closed, but Deb Smith-Cohen, who's the assistant branch manager at Patrick Henry, pulled everything together to make it possible for us to meet on Zoom tonight. We're very glad to be here. Our AAUW Vienna area branch is part of a national organization that's celebrating its 140th anniversary this year. AAUW is committed to the attainment of equity for women in especially focusing on the areas of education, employment, and economic opportunity. We do this in part through advocacy of legislation that will benefit women and families and society overall, because when women prosper, society prospers. So that's our interest in the legislative process, what brings us here tonight. And we're very pleased to have our two delegates who represent the greater Vienna area, Delegate Ken Plum and Delegate Mark Keam. Delegate Plum is in his 40th year of representing the 36th district of Virginia, which stretches from northwest Vienna to Reston. That will be changing soon, and we'll be talking about that in a moment. He was first elected in 1977, took a 2-year hiatus, and then has been serving continually since 1981. He's the chair of the Agriculture, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources Committee, and also serves on the Appropriations, Commerce, Technology, and Innovation, Public Safety, Joint Legislative Audit Review Committee, and the Joint Commission on Technology and Science. So Delegate Plum, if you'd like to take some time and speak about your ideas for the coming legislative session and plans for the same.
Well, thank you very much, Laurie, and thanks to the AAUW membership generally, and to the Fairfax County Public Library staff for putting this together. We're living in a new normal, and a new normal suggests that even if there's a big snowstorm, we can still get together and discuss public policy issues. In fact, we may be able to melt some snow with some of the issues we discussed tonight. I appreciate your participation for those of you who are in the audience, and I look forward to your questions and comments. I'm going to do a little bit by creating a context, because what's going to happen in Richmond starting on January 12th when the General Assembly convenes, and what happens in Richmond after January 15th when a new governor assumes office, will largely dictate the outcome of many of the issues we'll be talking about and will set the agenda. So we'll have to talk in some general terms, I think, to begin with, recognizing that all that's subject to change as those events unfold. We'll also, I think, probably at some point in the question go back to what the legislative district that Mark and I represent, because they're under change with the redistricting process. But first of all, I wanted to create a context to say that that business about me chairing the Agriculture, Commerce, and Natural Resource, Agriculture, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources Committee is going to be a matter of the past, because my party, the Democratic Party, lost the majority in the House, and that means we will lose our committee chairmanship. I'm particularly concerned that I've chaired the Joint Legislative Audit Review Commission for the past 2 years. It's kind of the GAO of state government, and I will lose that chairmanship as a result too of the way the system works, where the partisanship of individuals is recognized in the leadership roles. We have had an amazing 2 years, and those of you who are in touch with me over time know how much I have bragged about the progress we've made over the last 2 years. But we need to keep in perspective the fact that while I call it progress, much of what came about by way of change really came about with the result of one vote or so in the legislative body in the House and the Senate. There were close votes in change. Then we come to election together and we campaign on the basis of carrying the progressive platform of Virginia forward. And lo and behold, through no plans of our own, we lose the majority, not only in the House, but we lose the governorship, we lose the lieutenant governorship and the attorney general. So now it's a new day, and how much we can go forward with what we were working on in the past remains to be seen. I continue to look for indicators as to what the future might look like. And an indicator that came to me just in the last couple of days was in the Virginia Business Magazine, a publication of big business in Virginia out of the Richmond area. And it had an interview with the governor-elect Youngkin about his plans. And if I want to read you a couple lines because, and again, I know people don't like to be read to, but this I think creates a context. The magazine editor asked Mr. Youngkin, you come into office with a one-term limit and a pretty narrow margin to move an agenda. What are your top priorities in year one? And it's important to look at what his top priorities in year one is, because as governor, he has a lot of influence and he'll determine much of the direction. Here's what the magazine printed as his response. First and foremost, my top priority is to make sure that we press forward with our day one game plan, which is very clearly focused on making sure that we address some of the big challenges in Virginia. To make Virginia more competitive, we've got to get our taxes down, to bring down our cost of living. One of the big business issues we see in Virginia today is we've watched the cost of living really escalate in a runaway fashion. We're now above the national average, and Virginians are moving away faster than they're moving here from the other 49 states. Now, I must say that in the publication, what they did is they put a parenthesis then with an editor's note. Youngkin's assertion is based on IRS data that showed a net loss of Virginia taxpayers who moved to other states between 2013 and 2018. However, according to the U.S. Census Bureau data, Virginia population grew by more than 530,000 during the 2010s, even though 71,000 people left Virginia for other states. So plum contention about how well we've been doing and how attractive is Virginia for other people. We've got to get to work on eliminating the grocery tax and doubling our standard deduction and making sure that we do what we can to keep our veterans by excluding up to $40,000 of our veterans' retirement income from taxes. Going into this year, we're watching just massive overtaxation of Virginians. We've got to be more competitive with the states around us. Second is our schools. We've got to reestablish expectations of excellence in our schools. That's going to start with reestablishing high standards in our schools and then funding. The largest educational budget in the history of Virginia, our top priority, including raising teacher salaries, putting funding into facilities, and also funding our special education programs. Virginia kids with disabilities have suffered mightily over the last 2 years. We absolutely are going to press forward aggressively with a new charter school program. School choice in our public school has to be a giant element of K-12 education going forward. It's a big part of our day one agenda. Of course, finally, we're going to have a curriculum that focuses on allowing our children to soar. It's not a watered down curriculum. It's a curriculum that stretches our children. Now, I'm not going to go any further other than to say that obviously the governor has some different ideas as to where we are in Virginia and what we need to be doing going forward. And those are going to come to a collision starting on Saturday when we hear his inaugural address from the Capitol steps, and he becomes the new governor then going forward. For it is the case that Governor Northam has left behind a budget that addresses many issues that are critically important to us, that now if we put the emphasis on the fact that there's some quote overtaxation of Virginians, an assertion with which I'm going to tell you I disagree. But if we start off with that assertion and we say we're going to reduce a number of taxes, somehow something is going to give. And although we may talk about making sure we have quality school programs, unless we in fact fund those programs, we can talk all we want about how we have excellence for our children and all that. But if we do not do something to fund them, that's so important. Many of us with delight recognize that through an economy that was much more prosperous during the pandemic than we ever would have imagined it to be. When we recognized that business bounced back, at least in terms of our tax collections, much more quickly than we thought, and the federal government came through with a number of dollars that allowed us to get through the pandemic, we ended up with about $4 billion in monies beyond what had been expected to deal with the budget for the coming biennium. That was incredibly good news for a number of us. We have been talking about revising and revamping our mental health program for years. We've never quite come to do that. There are many people who get caught up in the system, a system that years ago, the main problem was that the mentally ill were in the jails. That's just 30 to 40% of the jail population were people who would have been better off in treatment. We have talked about adding waivers to the disability community in order that they can get treatment. But that the way in which we've done it has been so narrow and so slow that we have people now who've been on the waiver list for dozens of years. And that's unacceptable in a civilized society, it seems to me. So here we are in a clash of opinions, but you're probably not surprised by that we would have differences of opinion. Can we work those out? Well, of course, we will have to work them out. That's why you sent us down to do the job. I look forward to discussions throughout the course of the session from you, be it Zoom or whatever. And for heaven's sake, come see me. I always delight in visits from AAUW. You are a well-informed constituency. You know what you're talking about, and we can have meaningful discussions. And I also appreciate, again, the support of the library system for programs such as this going forward. Now, I think I'm going to stop there just because I wanted to create kind of a context, if you will. I don't mean to be a context of conflict, but the fact of the matter is we're going to have some different opinions going forward in Richmond, and somehow we have to figure out how to work those out.
Very good. Thank you, Delegate Plum, very much. And I do want to mention that AAUW is a nonpartisan organization. Both of our guests tonight are Democrats. Both of our guests tonight represent the areas, the greater Vienna area that our membership covers. And so that's how it happened that tonight we have two Democrats as guests. They are our current representatives. So Delegate Plum, again, thank you. And now Delegate Keam, who represents the 35th District in the General Assembly. He is, and that includes the entire town of Vienna, east to McLean at Route 267, and west along I-66 to Fair Lakes, roughly. Mark was first elected to the House of Delegates in 2009. He sits on the Commerce and Labor, Finance, Education, and Agriculture, Chesapeake Bay, and Natural Resources Committees. Delegate Keam, please.
Sure. Well, yes, thank you so much. First of all, Council Member Cole, I appreciate you continuing your public service in so many different ways. As many of you know, not only is she a leader of AAW, but she was also a public servant in her own right, serving many terms in the town of Vienna Town Council. But something that Lori and I have in common, which most people don't know in this area, is that we actually are from the same little town in California, way back when, Garden Grove, California. We ended up in the same high school. So we're old friends.
Well, Mark attended the high school I did many years after I was there,
well,
I'll say, but yes,
yeah.
Same high school.
Yeah, but we're contemporaries, and I've been blessed to have worked with you and served with you to represent the same people in the town of Vienna, and I see many of them on this call. So I want to thank you for your service, also for inviting us to be part of this. And likewise, I want to thank Amy Martin. She actually was the one that asked if I could make myself available to this meeting, whether it was going to be in person or virtual. We had no idea, but I said, absolutely. Any chance I get a chance to meet with our constituents and folks that are interested in what we do in the General Assembly, I would be happy to make that happen. So Amy, thank you for making time to arrange all this for us. And of course, Deb Smith-Cohen and all of our staff at the Patrick Henry Library, thank you for your service. Not only do I represent three, at least, as far as I know, three public, Tyson's Plymouth, Patrick Henry, and of course Oakton Library, which is my office away from home. I use that office so often that everybody there knows me personally when I walk in the door. But I also have the honor of having carried legislation a couple of years ago, which actually became law, and it passed unanimously. House Bill 404 in the 2020 session declares as a policy of the Commonwealth of Virginia that libraries, public libraries, not only serve a public education service, but also essential services to our community. It's something that I added to the policy language to ensure that public libraries will always be seen and viewed and be funded and supported by the community as essential service. Because as you can see, even though the federal government, all our schools and the roads are closed today, we're still working because the library is always there for you to serve the community in the most urgent times. And so we are absolutely an essential service. I'm just going to plug the fact that our state also recognizes that, thanks to the work that Delegate Plum and I and so many others have done to represent your interests. So let me also finally say, before we get into the conversation, as Delegate Plum mentioned, he was and it still is, at least until January 12th, my chairman on the Agriculture Committee. And he's also the most senior member of our House of Delegates. And so he certainly brings years of wisdom and ideas. But unfortunately, he will not be serving in the chairmanship, at least for the next year or so. I have until January 12th still hold a gavel for a couple of committees. I'm a vice chair of a finance committee where I also chair a couple of the subcommittees. But for the purposes of the AAUW, and you meaning university women, I am the chairman of the Higher Education and Secondary Education Subcommittee in the House Education Committee. So higher education and supporting our colleges and universities and lifelong learning and secondary education has always been a passion of mine. I wouldn't be who I am today, coming as an immigrant from another country, if it wasn't for the public education that I had the benefit of receiving all throughout high school, college, and even graduate school, all public schools. I would not be able to stand here today as your state delegate. So I'm just such a big supporter of public education. I hope that all of us who have the benefit and the privilege of having some education will continue to ensure that our state and all of our young people have the best education possible. And I think that's one area where Delegate Plum and I really share a passion of making sure that education is going to be our top priority always. And in that context, let me segue to what we're going to and you heard a great overview already from Delegate Plum, but I think it really bears repeating. And this is not a partisan or a political statement. It's just a matter of fact. We have a new governor. We have a new House majority, and myself and Delegate Plum will be in the minority party. And I think it's safe to say, without getting into any kind of political or partisan dynamic, that we are in fact going to be in a different values conversation, different set of priorities, because the other political party that won the majority this year and the governorship bring a different perspective. Now, let's put it this way. If you take all the campaign rhetoric away, if you take all the commercials and all the thousands of phone calls and text messages you received over last year, and just assume that the campaigns and politics has nothing to do with it, and just looked at the conversation, absolutely, we both agree, both parties agree that the economy should be strong. We both agree that we got to get rid of this COVID once and for all, defeat this, and make sure that we go back to some level of normalcy for all of our society. We absolutely want to keep our schools to be the best from K through 12, maybe pre-K, all the way through secondary education. We want to ensure that our healthcare system is as strong and robust as possible for those that need the help. And we also want to make sure our streets are safe, that all of our families can feel comfortable and safe when they're walking around or going to the parks or going shopping, and that the roads are clear and that we have essential services. So that part, I don't think there's anything political or partisan about that. It's what you put money into and how you prioritize it and what version of those things that you want. That's the difference. And in the case of education, to start with, I believe Delegate Plum and I can speak for him. I think we value very much the public education system that we have. We have to ensure that K through 12 is fully funded. That means both the state portion as well as the county and the localities, and doing everything we can to ensure that teachers are treated as professional as they are. They're paid at the national average or higher, and that we provide the essential EP teachers, the English as a second language teachers, and other counselors on the school so that they can help the social and emotional development of our kids. We want to make sure that we have technology and the roof over their heads and the facilities in the schools, that everything can be done perfectly. We all know that our public school systems could be better. And so our focus is to prioritize funding for public education. What our opponent, the other side of the political aisle, will say is absolutely they agree that education is important, but they believe that public education is so in some ways so bad and in such a bad condition that rather than trying to fix the system that we have, they'd rather try alternatives. So this governor has already talked about having 20 more charter schools and other reforms that bring in school choice and parental choice, homeschool options, and parochial schools and such. There's nothing wrong with that. We want to have options, but we got to make sure that we have the basics and the fundamentals done first. We want to fix the essentials first before experimenting. So I think those are the areas we're going to see some opinion. If the difference is slight, we're happy to work with them, look for compromise. But if the differences are such that they're going to gut public education at the cost of something that's radically different, a reform agenda that's based on privatizing or creating charter schools that we just don't think are working, then we're going to have to stand strong against that value. And we're hopefully that the House Democrats will stand against that. But if not, we do know that the state Senate is run by a different political majority than the House. And so I think you're going to see some of those points where if something passes one chamber, it may or may not pass the other chamber and vice versa. So I think those are some areas where you're going to see some conversations about how we might share the same values and the same goals, but we may try to approach it a different way. And so I think we'll have longer conversations about that. And I know you have a lot of other questions as well. So why don't I start with just that as a preview, and happy to open up to questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Delegate Keam. I have a question that I'll take the prerogative of having the floor for both of you. The congressional redistricting in Virginia got an awful lot of attention, but the House of Delegates, the entire General Assembly, was subject to new district boundaries being drawn as well. Can each of you briefly address what has happened to your district, how you see that affecting you and your constituents and the General Assembly going forward? Delegate Plum.
Certainly, Laurie. The reason you hear more about the congressional redistricting as opposed to the state level redistricting is there are only 11 congressional districts. So it's kind of easy to look at a map and see what happened to them. And what happened to them was that the districts became much more compact and contiguous. They weren't these scrambling things that ran all over the state that looked like some people like a salamander. But we now are getting to a set of criteria for compactness, and that makes more sense. The same standards have been applied to the 100-member districts of the House of Delegates. Again, if you took a look at the last several redistrictings, both led by Democrats and led by Republicans, you find that they were assortments of precincts attached together with one common objective, and that was to elect the incumbent. I worked for 4 decades on how it was that we could come up with another system of having someone with some independence draw the lines. Now, I don't know if we want to take up much time tonight to talk about whether that was accomplished with the current system. Certainly the current system, or the new system, was pretty cumbersome, pretty slow and whatever. But ultimately the product, I think if you step back and said, I'm going to look at this objectively, not as a Democrat, not as a Republican, I'm going to look at it objectively. Does it create representation of people rather than picking candidates to be elected for office? I believe the conclusion will be that it does. Now, it turns out that my district, which is primarily Ruston, it was close to the size of a legislative district anyway. What the masters, those people employed by the Supreme Court to draw the lines, did was simply trim off some at the bottom that reached down towards Vienna and add a little more at the top that reached towards Herndon, but otherwise the district stayed pretty much intact. When that was done, irrespective of where it is that the incumbents live, 40-some incumbents find themselves in a district with somebody else. And then they have to kind of work that out. They either choose to move, or they choose to move or run in a district in which they do not live or whatever. That was independent decisions. More complicating the fact is that we have essentially had the Supreme Court set down the dictate that these are the new districts. So I'm Ken Plum, former delegate from the 36th district, now to be delegate from the 7th district, because part of what the process did was to renumber the districts, as if we didn't have enough confusion already. It cut down on the number of times it tried to slice up localities so that, again, you didn't have somebody living on one side of the street in a town represented by somebody and somebody on the other side of the street represented by someone else. It also then opens a question as to when do we go to truly representing the new districts, because as you go throughout the state, you will find some districts change so drastically that the person who may represent a district no longer lives in that district. How does that get worked out? Well, there's a court suit now being undertaken by the Virginia Supreme Court as to whether or not there has to be a set of elections held where we run in our new districts. I just ran for election, as did Mark. We were both elected in our districts. but our districts are no longer the districts that are on the map for the constituency. So will we need to run again? I will tell you from personal experience, I was elected in 1981, I was elected in 1982, and I was elected in 1983, because at that point in time, in order to get the new districts in place, the court dictated that there be annual elections. Gee, that must be terrible to have to do. And as I say to people, my name recognition was pretty high after that, but it's one of the ways in which you try to get parallelism between who it is you represent and when you were elected. So that part of it, how the elections are going to go, unknown to me. Maybe Mark's going to be able to tell me tonight. I look forward to earnestly hear that. But how it is that we represent today, when you come to Richmond, you need to look at your little cheat sheet and figure out who is it represents you now and who might represent you in the future and whatever. But anyway, that's kind of where we are now.
Thank you. Delegate Keam, what does it mean for the 35th, soon to be 12th?
Yeah, first of all, yes, as Delegate Plum just mentioned, our district numbers will change because the special masters who redrew the lines based on the Supreme Court's edict took, I don't know which way they started, but they started with district number 1 from whichever corner of the state, and then they just kind of worked either clockwise or counterclockwise and just renumbered everything, as opposed to what it is now, which is somewhat random. And so if I'm still in the same position in a year or two, or whenever the next election happens, the district I represent now, which is number 35, will be number 12. And the biggest difference, just from a geographic perspective, is right now my district starts in McLean and goes west along 66 and 495. In fact, my wife likes to tell her friends that I represent the Tysons Mall, the Fair Oaks Mall, and some houses in between. Just saying, that's her perspective. But the way I would look at it is the new district would start from the Tysons Vienna area, and then we work south of 66 all the way down almost to the Mosaic district, not quite the Merrifield area, but kind of in that area. So as opposed to going east to west, I'll be going north and south. But good news for the folks who live in the town of Vienna, or maybe not good news because I might be a representative, but the good news is that the town is still intact, and it'll be the same district that I currently represent, along with the Dunloring and the Tysons and a little bit of the Oakton side of things, that area. So that's a change. The only thing other thing I'd say is, number one, I absolutely respect and commend Delegate Plum for his years of advocacy on this. He has been the voice of transparency and nonpartisan and non-political redistricting in the General Assembly for a long time, and it was his guiding light that brought all of us together to focus on making this a non-political process. Toward the end, unfortunately, we had some divisions, not only within our caucus but across the country, or the state as well, about what the new lines mean, what the new commission means, who's going to be on there, is it going to be too political or not. And because it was somewhat rushed at the end, and because it ended up in a unfortunate political deadlock, we are now in the Supreme Court situations. But we don't need to get into any of the conversations about how we got to where we are. The key is how do we ensure that everybody, well, obviously assuming that the litigation and everything wraps up, and whenever we are told when we're supposed to run again, how do we ensure that everybody knows what the new lines are, which precincts that they're going to be attending, and not just for the state house and the state senate, but for congressional races as well. And also ensuring that the counties, as you all know, the counties have to do their own redistricting in terms of magisterial districts, and then eventually there'll be school district realignments as well. That we want to make sure that the constituents are aware of who their representatives could be, who their choices are, where they come out to vote, and what it is that they have to vote. And so the final point on this, both in terms of redistricting and elections generally, is last year has been tremendously different in the way we voted because of some major reforms that we put in place. We took away some of the photo ID requirements. We added we took away the excuses that you needed to be able to vote in absentee. We also added the number of days that you can have absentee balloting. We also reduced the process for having witnesses during the COVID emergency. So over the last 2 election cycles, we made a huge difference in allowing for as many people to vote. As a result, you saw 55% of Virginians participate in the last statewide elections. We're seeing now bills that have already been filed by some colleagues on the other side of the aisle who will take every one of those away. Take away the absentee ballots, take away excuse ballots, use more photo ID, making it tougher and tougher to vote in early or on the day of. And so from that perspective, the thing that I think we need to really focus on now is, in addition to whatever happens with redistricting, how do we ensure that as many people who are eligible can vote with as little obstacles or burdens that get in the way?
Very important. Yes, certainly an issue that AAUW is engaged in and supports. The second question, and then we'll open it up to the questions people have been submitting to the chat. And please, if you have a question for our guests tonight, put them in the chat and we will pose them that way. The budget surplus. Virginia finds itself in the enviable position of having a substantial surplus this as we go into this budget process. Delegate Keam, what is your anticipation of how best this surplus can be used, and what's the likelihood of other fates coming to it?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And this is one of those rare occasions where we are talking about having too much money in the state as opposed to not enough money, which is the usual process that we have these conversations. The good news is we do have some surplus thanks to the congressional support, of course, which is all our taxpayer money, but it comes from federal government through the various relief bills that we've had since COVID began. And so we do have some surplus money. And because of the fact that over the last year and a half, we've had a very fiscally conservative and sensible approach to our budgeting. And I know Delegate Plum is on the Appropriations Committee, so he's been looking at these numbers much more closely. But because of the efforts of Governor Northam and all of us in the General Assembly, we've been able to put away a lot of money in the rainy day fund, the Stabilization Fund, which is something that helps us keep our AAA bond at the Wall Street bankers and such. We've also been able to spend money on things that we've talked about for years and years and years and never able to do, such as infrastructure for rural broadband, for example, last mile broadband. That's something that's going to cost about $750 million. Nobody in the private sector would ever come up with that money. We could never find that much money out of a chunk of a budget, but because of the surplus, we were able to pay for that. We're also putting away some money for things like school construction, which we talked about this earlier, but there are some buildings that are really dilapidated and we'll never come up with enough cash just to pay for those schools unless there's a surplus like this. Now, if it was up to me, if I was a governor, if I was writing the budget, I would say put as much of that money into our ID and DD waivers as possible. It is something that I know Ricky and Lucy and I and many of us have been talking about for days, for months and years and years and years. We have still, even after paying down and paying for some of the priority one cases, we still have so many more ID and DD waiver eligible Virginians who really need this. It is for some people, it's a matter of life and death. And yet that's a big chunk of money that we would love to put away. The governor, the outgoing governor, Northam, has put out a budget, and we were there a couple of weeks ago when he presented the budget. It's a very robust budget that has really good balance for education, for some of the infrastructure and such. The problem is the governor who wrote that budget is not going to be governor when we start working on that budget. And so starting January 15th or whenever it is, we're going to be having a whole new different set of eyes. Majority party will be looking at their version of the budget. So what we need to do, what y'all need to do, if you like what's in the current budget, please fight for that. Please make sure your voice is heard. Please ask the General Assembly members that these are high priority bills, amendments and such. Keep it in there. And if it's not in there already, it's not too late. We're going to fight like heck to make sure that our priorities are funded this year for public education, for healthcare, for infrastructure, and of course, making sure that we have some of the money put away into the rainy day fund so that we can avoid the next deficit. Now, the other side, I'll keep this very brief because Delegate Plum did a great job in already reading what the incoming governor wants to do. He believes that that money not only belongs to the people, but needs to be given back to the people in the way of tax cuts and tax vouchers and giveaways. And so what you're going to see from the other side is a huge, well, maybe not a huge, but at least a check with somebody's signature on it saying, here's your money back. Well, after you spend that $300 or $600, it'll be gone, at least as far as your family is concerned. But for the state, that means billions and millions of dollars that we could have spent on other priorities will be gone as well. So I think that's going to be one of the areas we're going to have a conversation about is what are our priorities? How do we use this once in a lifetime surplus for our priorities?
Very good. Thank you, Delegate Keam. Delegate Plum, you had mentioned mental health as an area that this surplus could benefit. Are there any other areas that you would like to see it focused?
Yeah, absolutely. And all right, let me first raise concern about calling this money surplus. Surplus suggests that you funded all you need to fund and you got some money left over. The fact of the matter is that what we've been doing for decades in Virginia is we've been eking out a little bit of money for a whole lot of programs, and then we go home and say we have a balanced budget. And what we leave behind are a number of programs that are grossly underfunded. And we have programs that for decades have gone underfunded. So when you have programs underfunded, and you happen to get a little money from the federal government and the economy is a little robust and you get some money, how could that be considered a surplus? It's money available to meet needs. And there are existing needs that are there. I mentioned the waivers as it relates to disabled. That's an area in which, again, shame on us. We have given lip service to doing something about this, and we've eked out a little bit of money and tried to make people happy with that, when in fact we've got to get serious as a society and say that these folks need the services. Unquestionably, they need the services that are available, and it's not fair to fall on the backs of families to support all those needs. So that it clearly is an area. Also within the unfunded category over the years has been our lip service to mental health services. Here we've had situations of where people not having services available to them end up in the jailhouse because of a behavior problem that came about not because they're bad people, but because they're sick people. And what we need to do with sick people is not lock them up. We need to provide treatment. And so we have, for several years, talked about reform in our mental health program, but we've been really scanty about how it is that we fund it. Furthermore, then too, when we talk about disparities in our public education system, it is the case that if you're white, you do very well. And if you're brown or black, you may not do as well in our public schools. You can't have that happening. We need to be a society that recognizes the needs and abilities of all students and taking the kind of steps necessary to make that programs possible. Now, the governor has in mind school choice. My experience in watching the school choice movement over the country has been that the well-funded kids get to go off to an alternative school and they have a nice time and a nice education. But the public school system, which had to give up some money in order to fund those private efforts, find itself with fewer funds to spend. If you want to start your own public school, if you want to run a private school on your own, I say to you, go at it. You can do that now in Virginia. But my beef comes when you say you're going to take the money away from the schools that serve the children generally and use them exclusively for a group of children who want to go to a school setting beyond a regular population. So the school choice thing is not a way to create alternatives. You create alternatives within the public school sector using the resources that are available in the public school sector and the funding that's available there, and then you offer to a broader range of students. Also now, climate change is upon us. When is it that we're going to hear that climate change is upon us? There could be dire consequences around the corner. What are we doing in Virginia, for example, with carbon capture? The new governor has said that he's going to get us out of RGGI. That's a carbon tax program that has been successful in reducing our carbon emissions in Virginia. And apparently now there's talk about us leaving that. No, we can't leave at a time like this. The climate change is too serious an issue to walk away from. So we're going to have a discussion about that. I'll stop, but there's still some other things you could list as well needing funding.
Many things. Yes. Thank you very much. Our extraordinary program VP for our Vienna area branch, Amy Martin, who was instrumental in putting this program together, she and her co-VP, Connie Dillman, have been monitoring the chat. And so they should have some questions from our attendees for the delegates.
This is Amy speaking, and I'm glad to hear that you are already discussing the issue about developmentally challenged people who need additional health, and the waivers, if I understood it correctly, are part of that issue. And this first question was from Ricky Epstein from ARC, and then related to that, Mary Nell and Beth Clark mentioned the fact that there's such a long wait list and that their daughter is on the wait list. So you have mentioned several things you would like to see done for the developmentally disabled people. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Well,
yes, Delegate Plum.
Off of a May, because Ricky is a constituent of mine, and I appreciate her being on the call tonight. We've discussed this issue many times. Unfortunately, our discussions have never led to a satisfactory conclusion, because the conclusion is we know what the programs are. We know what the services that are needed. And when we talk about people being on a waiting list, we're not being on a waiting list for a year or 2 years. No, we're being on a waiting list for 10 to 20 years. in a society, we can't allow that to be happening. So the situation is clear, it seems to me, that we know what kind of program is needed, what kind of treatment modalities are needed, what kind of support's needed among families with children with disabilities. And what we need to do is to make an investment in those on behalf of the whole community. And so it's a matter of not trying to create something new. It's a matter of putting our money into programs that already work for those people who are lucky enough to get into them now.
The only thing I would add to that, Amy, and thank you for the question, and for Ricky and Matt and others who raised your concerns as well. I don't think you've heard a little bit about partisan differences earlier, but this is one of those areas where it really is not a partisan thing. I think it's just more of knowledge thing. There are some families who say, hey, my family's fine, my kids are healthy, everything's great. Why do I have to worry about other families? Because we don't need that help. And so in their mind, it's just something that they're not aware of. Now, in some ways, I think COVID has become the great equalizer, not only in the United States, but globally. It is one of the few times in human history where everybody had to deal with things that they've never had to deal with before, and the same way. For example, isolation, mental health. All of a sudden, every parent becoming a part-time teacher, every adult becoming a childcare specialist, all of a sudden having to reconfigure your house to accommodate more people than you're normally used to, or not even having space in the house and having to find places for people to spread out and work and do things around the house. And then physically being together 24/7 to know every single nuance of every single person that you're living with. For people like myself and others who might have healthier family members, we might not think much of that. It's inconvenient, maybe. It might be a little bit tough. I wish we had maybe an extra bedroom or something, but beyond that, it wasn't all that big of a deal for me. But if you can put yourself in the position of a family member, like some of you who are joining us tonight, who might have a loved one, a family, a daughter, a son, or foster care child, or somebody, or even an adult who can't function, him or herself, who needs that 24/7 help by somebody all the time in a confined area where you don't have the kind of resources, you don't have the size of a kitchen or the size of a bathroom that you need to really take care of them. And then to add to that, the fact that the only resource that you have are people that might be willing to come in to help you, and yet they're being paid less than minimum wage. Here we're talking about essential services, essential people working in grocery shops and bus drivers and such. But these are people that are taking care of things that even some family members might want to do for their own family members. And yet we're paying them less than minimum wage in terms of the actual living costs that they're putting in. So the reality is, I am hoping that all of us will finally put ourselves in the position of those that are suffering insufferably from COVID, whether it's mental or physical or otherwise. And just for a second, think about what somebody else's life could be, because all they're asking for, those that need our waivers, is a life like ours, like a normal person like mine. And I don't say normal in the pejorative way. I just mean that somebody who doesn't have any obvious flaws in my healthcare. For me, I don't have much inconveniences, but for somebody who does suffer this physical or intellectual disabilities, I know that that person has to deal with so much more. And so can we just for a second take time out and think about what life is like, and then make that argument for every legislator to say, wouldn't you want to put that money away if that was your family member? Isn't it worth putting a few $1,000,000, frankly? That's all we're talking about. We're not talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. We're talking about a few $1,000,000 just to get through this cycle, and then the cycle after that, cycle after that. So I'm really hoping that cooler heads and reasonable heads will prevail and keep this one of our highest priorities for in a bipartisan way.
Thank you very much, Delegate Keam. Another question is somewhat related to this, and actually there's two that are related to leave and childcare and the issues that are facing people who are trying to do everything all at the same time. Susan Pauley of AAUW talks about the fact that if we do have the economic ability, is there a possibility that you and Delegate Plum would support the bill that is being introduced into the Senate in terms of paid family and medical leave in the Commonwealth? Can we count on your support or co-sponsoring this legislation in the House?
Delegate
First,
Plum, if you'll
Yes,
take it.
the answer is absolutely yes. It represents what would be a normal next step from the progress we've made over the last 2 years. We made significant steps forward in raising pay and helping improve working conditions and eliminating discrimination in the workplace over the last 2 years. A normal next step would be the kind of bill that you're talking about going forward. And again, had the election results been different, I think we could have counted on that. But the election results being what it is, I need to say to you that, yes, I will be lending my support to that legislation, but it needs a whole lot of work on part of a whole lot of people who say to this new administration, we need you to keep on track with these kind of programs that are so important to families and so important to our economy and to our workforce. So yes, I look forward to co-sponsoring that legislation.
Yes, not only will I, but I have already in the past. Every time that bill has been introduced, and I've introduced similar budget amendments several times in my career so far as well. And one of my good friends and a constituent of mine, David Broder, is the president of the SEIU local chapter here. And I know that's one of his highest priorities. We talk about this all the time when we get together. And so absolutely family leave and paid medical leave is paid leave is an important thing. It's unbelievable that the United States of America is the only developed nation in the whole wide world, the only one that's a developed nation that does not have a government program that says, if you want to take some time off from work, by God, you have a right to do so, and you should be paid for that. We don't do that. We just don't do that. And so, maybe it's the whole Horatio Alger thing. Maybe it's the idea that Americans are so tough, we don't need a time off. But the reality is we all do. And especially those that have young children at home. I was really disappointed that, frankly, Congress couldn't get it done last year or this past year when they're working on the infrastructure bill, and that was one of the unfortunate carved out provisions. And so I'm hoping that now everybody knows what it is. Now we just have to come up with the political will to keep it and make it happen.
If I could interject here before we go to the next question, both this issue and the previous one have both of you supporting them, and your constituents here tonight are represented by people who support an issue that they obviously support. How effective is it for people, for your constituents, to go to other delegates and say, I don't live in your district, but I'd really like to see you support issue X?
Well, each of us have life experiences that we can share wherever it is we live. And for those who are in work situations where leave is so critically important, telling that story is important. It also is the case that you belong to associations and organizations that cover more than these districts. So what you could work on doing is to make sure that all the chapters of AAUW, League of Women Voters, ARC, whatever, join with you in making it a united front. If this just becomes a District 7 and District 12 priority alone, it ain't gonna go anyplace. It's got to encompass not just the suburban needs of Virginia, but it has to also encompass the wide, vast areas of rural Virginia that have a whole different economic situation, and we have to figure out how we can also accommodate them.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is, in addition to, it's always nice to hear from constituents directly because they are the ones that we represent directly, but you're all Virginians, and these are issues that affect all Virginians, and your organization is a national and a statewide organization, so you can certainly use the name of the organization as a member. But even more than that, in advocacy, some people might say, sometimes quality is more important than quantity. You got to get the right person to talk to the right person, which is true. But there are times when it's quality and quantity. Because if you only have one person talking about something and 99 people are talking about something else, guess what they're going to be talking about? The one that 99 people are talking about. So if you can get more voices across the board, if you use social media, generate a lot of social media volume on that. If you do letters of the editor, op-eds, whatever it takes, make phone calls. If many people are talking about it in committee meetings and such, somebody has to say, yeah, what's this about? I don't understand. None of my constituents talk to me, but I keep hearing about this everywhere. What is this about? Get that interest peaked. And so you got to have both quality and quantity.
Thank you. Amy.
Thank you. I have a question here that has a specific take on a question that's a broader question, which is the difficulty of getting good child care and of supporting the people who give that child care. And as women, we know that the burden of that falls very much on us. So we have a vested interest in that, but we also have a vested interest for all of the families in our area and in this country. Norman Hall's question, I'm going to read it directly, has a specific twist on that in terms of the union that he represents. Good evening. I am a Fairfax County employee, a longtime Vienna resident, and now serve on the executive board of the SEIU's Unit for County Employees. When the pandemic hit, I was a SACC teacher and have been advocating for more childcare support to help families and for collective bargaining to help the county staff who work with children. This includes the library staff. Our local childcare system is far from what it needs to be to fully support local economic growth. The last thing we need is to see state policy. State policy change that model. What's the best way for a union voice on this to make sure that services continue the way we in Fairfax and Vienna see best?
Delegate Keam, why don't you
Sure.
start
First,
here?
Norman, thank you for your question, and thank you for being an SEIU member. As I just mentioned, David Broder among many of the SEIU members that I deal with all the time, and thank you for your advocacy. You know, in some ways, you know, maybe Delegate Plum and I are just lucky because we represent Fairfax County residents, but Fairfax County does so many things right. We happen to be the largest jurisdiction. We also happen to be a little bit on the economically better side of things, and more importantly, we have people that really care and understand these issues in nuances, and so we can have these conversations. And so I think Fairfax County has been a leader on this. Unfortunately, for the rest of the Commonwealth and many of the counties that don't have that level of interest or frankly, the investments that people want to make, they just don't think that this is important to them, but it really is important for everyone. And so I'm hoping that rather than having the states come in and meddle with Fairfax County, it should be the other way around, that we use Fairfax County's model as an example. And that might be a good segue, just a quick mention about this. I think Delegate Plum is phoning a friend here. A quick little segue on this is that one of the areas that the incoming governor talked about a lot during his campaign is his tax reform bills. And in addition to giving out refunds, he also wants to get rid of the grocery taxes, which frankly, all of us would love to get rid of all the taxes, right? I mean, wouldn't it be a great world if we didn't pay any taxes at all? I mean, I'd have more cash in my pocket. But the reality is that grocery taxes and so many other taxes, gas taxes, they pay for things like essential services that not only stay at state level, but they come down to the local levels. We have earmarked money for every one of these taxes that go to local services. And so in addition to the childcare issue that we just talked about, the threat is that if the governor says, oh, we're going to get rid of grocery taxes, it sounds great. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to do? But the reality is that also takes away money from local services that there's no other sources of funding for. So we got to be really careful. And I'm old enough to remember when another governor came in and said he was going to eliminate the car tax. Well, guess what? I still pay car taxes every single year. And so we got to be really careful when the governor comes in and says they're going to get rid of a tax, but then at the end of the day, the localities have to make up that money somewhere else. And that means you and I have to reach it deeper in our own pockets for something that's a local program.
Delegate Keam, Delegate Plum, do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, well, Norman, let me first of all suggest to you that if you want to know how to go about lobbying for something, just follow the example that you guys with SEIU do. You're among the best that I know of representing the interests of the employees who are part of your organization. Your members come to see us. They bring very personal stories to tell us. And from that, we become better, knowledgeable representatives of your citizen interest. On the matter of childcare, it's rather amazing that, again, in a modern society in the United States of America, in the wealthiest nation in the world, the 12th wealthiest state in the union, and in communities that are among the wealthiest of the wealthiest states, that we still lag behind on childcare. And part of it grew out of a attitude from centuries gone by of what the role of the family should be and whether or not the children should be reared in a home situation or whether it was okay to have childcare or not. Believe it or not, some of that cultural bias in terms of how people raise their family still is present in the structure as it is now. The economic reality is that there are people who need to go to work because they need to pay the groceries, they need to pay the rent, they need to do all those kind of things that you need to do in order to survive in the economy in which we live. So as a result, child care programs are very helpful, not only to make time available for parents to carry out their obligations, but the early intervention programs that can be carried out through childcare programs and preschool programs are incredibly successful for the long-term growth of the child education. The best way to intervene in terms of educational needs of children who are not doing well and so on, is to put them in early intervention programs at the very earliest that they are recognized. And those educational programs can bring the children along in terms of development and prepare them for public education and so on when they go forward. So there are a number of reasons why I'm pleased with what Fairfax County has done. And I commend SEIU and others who work so hard to make that come about. I might tell you, just as a little historic artifact, is that the SACC program that you mentioned, the SAC program that provides daycare before and after school in our schools, when it first opened many decades ago, its first administrator was myself. I volunteered to the superintendent to bring the program under adult education in the schools in order to get it started, because there seemed not to be anybody who was interested in running it. Well, the program went off with a blaze because there were so many people who had such pent-up needs and so on that it became a very successful program now. And I think it'd be possible to take it away, because we recognize not only its value in keeping children safe, but we recognize its value in giving children a boost, an extra start. We used to call it Head Start sometimes, towards their further education.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Delegate Plum.
much.
Yes.
Could you please define SACC?
Uh,
School age
initials?
childcare, right?
Okay,
yeah,
is that it?
school-age
Okay, I
childcare.
wanted to be sure.
Yeah,
Just
thank you.
not all of us are as adept at the initials as
Well,
everybody else.
Sometimes when you use the initials too often, you forget what they stand for. But it stands for Good Programs for Children.
Mhm. Exactly. I have two other questions, and after that, we could open the floor if there's anybody else who wants that. There was a question from Susan Burke about the number of bills that can be introduced is limited again this year. And I know they did it last year because of the health situation and the limited meeting time. Is there any limit to the number of bills that a delegate can co-sponsor?
Delegate Keam, why don't you take that one?
Well, the two parts. First, there's never a limit for how many bills you can co-sponsor, meaning somebody else's bill that you put your name on. That there's never a limit on that. But there are limits on the number of bills you can introduce, but that limit only applies to one of the two legislative sessions. So this coming year, one that's starting next week, is what we call the long year, because 60 days is long, and then 45-day session after that is a short session. The long sessions, we normally don't have bill limits. The short sessions we do, and normally there's limits about 15, but this year, as far as I know, the Republican leadership, the Speaker of the House has not declared that there will be any limits, which means that we're going back to the traditional way of not having limits. And you're right that last year we had a very restricted limit of 7 bills as opposed to even 15 because we did everything virtually. So yeah, there is no limits this year.
But I tell you what, the bill limitation is not all bad, because when you get 140 people together with bright ideas about what we ought to be doing, and they all put in a couple of bills, and not just a couple sometimes, but dozens of bills in order to bring about a change in the direction of the Commonwealth, we get all bogged down in all that. You know, even as it is, we're talking about 2,500 bills and resolutions to be considered in 60 days. Well, you do the math and figure out how many bills we have to take up a day and how fast we have to deal with them. My personal perspective is to pay attention to what others now are introducing and to make sure that we don't have duplicate introduction, that we're not putting the bill because somebody else put it in. And we also need to become aware of the fact that it's not important that you have your name on the bill. What's important is what you stand for and what you value and what you express and what you help get passed. It doesn't matter who gets the credit. The people who we want to get the credit are the taxpayers, the constituents, the mom and dads in the community who get good government as a result of what we do, not because their delegate goes flying a flag on behalf of his or her own personal interest.
Thank you.
One last question. There was a question from Deb and from the library. Is there any potential for initiatives to be funded or increased funding to reduce the risk of homelessness and eviction? and to address housing affordability in the upcoming legislative sessions?
The answer is yes. The Joint Legislative Audit Review Commission that I chair just completed a comprehensive look at our housing program. We are about halfway through that study. And what is clear to us is that we need additional resources to be made available to communities and developers to increase the housing stock. You know, it is the case, as much as you see construction going up, there's a net shortage of housing available for people who can afford housing. Well, guess what? If you can't afford it, you're definitely in the street. So as a consequence, it's necessary to intervene in a very meaningful way. And this is another example of where I talk about, how can you say you got a surplus when you got people sleeping on the street? We need to look at that money invested in our Housing Development Corporation and in helping groups locally, like Cornerstones, for example, that does an excellent job of identifying housing and making it available to people. So housing is back on the forefront of an issue. And I hope again that the outgoing Governor Northam's proposal to add substantial new monies to housing will in fact be enacted.
Just one very quick point on the housing, and I absolutely agree with what Delegate Plum said too. But one point that we should all be proud of, and during the last, now it's been almost 2 years, but 19 or 20 months since we've been dealing with COVID, as you know, some of the relief funds that came from Congress were targeted at mortgage and rent relief, especially rent for low-income renters. And our state, I understand that we were the best state in terms of turning around and make sure that money left. Came as soon as it came to our Richmond, it went straight to the relief that people needed. There are some states that some of my colleagues in other states in the legislature, I was at a conference recently and they were talking about how they still had so many millions of dollars left in their bank, in their accounts, because they didn't have the infrastructure to figure out who needs the relief and such. And we were able to turn that money around. There was not a single penny that was left in our funds because we turned that around. So I think housing is one of those few areas where across the board, everybody knows that that's not only an important, you need shelter, but it's something that in Northern Virginia, we know because housing is so expensive. In other parts of the Commonwealth, they know because there's housing shortage. And so I think this is an area where we should see some bipartisanship.
Thank you. I noticed that Deb Smith Cohen put up a follow-up note on that. Amy, do you want to
Why don't you go
address
ahead?
that? Oh, okay. Then I have to look
Okay,
at the
well, never
chat.
mind. It's what she's saying is too many people are using the libraries for shelter in cold and hot weather, and that continues to make the issue visible to us. The work on this issue matters so much. Thank you. And she's absolutely right. And I'm sure she sees it more than I do, but I'm in the library a lot. And you see that. You see that Vienna, which is one of the richest communities in Fairfax County, which is one of the richest counties, and you still see homeless people out on the street. The need is really great.
Yeah.
Yes. While we have a few more moments, maybe there'll be some more questions coming in. Do each of you want to talk about your legislative priorities for this coming session? Have you introduced any legislation yet? There wasn't, while some has been showed up as pre-filed for some other delegates, is there anything that you anticipate filing? Mark, how about if you go first?
Sure, I'll start. Well, first of all, I have not filed any yet, and I don't plan on filing any until the first day of session. It's just been a long practice of mine because I don't really care whether my number is 1 or 2,000 as far as my bill number is concerned. But I do want to make sure that, to Delegate Plum's point, I don't like to put in the same bill that somebody else already did. So as I'm working on it, if I hear that other people are doing it, I'm not going to do it. But in my area has going to be, or at least one of my, there have been 3 or 4 areas of focus that I've spent my career. One of them is on clean energy and environment and working on sustainability and climate change with Delegate Plum, especially on the Ag Committee. But another area that I've been focusing a lot is about workforce development and how do we transition the young people that are learning now. And my kids are both in college now, but I going through their from K through 12, knowing the classrooms and the curriculum that they were exposed to and the experiences that they were getting in the Fairfax high schools. Is that really going to match the jobs that are going to be in the future when they're growing up and they're in the workforce? And to me, that's been one of my passions, is to figure out a way that our workforce of the future will be trained and equipped to do the kind of work that we don't even know what job's going to be in the future yet. And there are plenty of other countries, Germany, Italy, Korea, Taiwan. There are lots of countries that are focusing on this area. This is one of the few places that America is slowly falling behind. And if we don't catch up, we may not. And as specific to that issue, I have a bill that I think it's going to be one of my favorite bills. I'm calling it the Commonwealth College Completion Fund program, and it's a fund that will hopefully receive some funds from the federal Build Back Better, if and when that bill passes, to receive some federal funding, which will be targeted to ensure that those that started college but ended up dropping out of college, or for some reason weren't able to finish their college, can actually finish that college. And I've heard anecdotes about people that, for example, received a parking ticket and they weren't able to pay for the parking ticket, and that is on the record now, and that's an obstacle to them re-enrolling in school because they have an outstanding parking ticket. Well, if somebody else could pay that $50 parking ticket, that person can get back into class, but that's become a hurdle for them, and as a result, they end up not going back semester, 2 semesters, and all of a sudden they're in their 30s and they're thinking, I really wish we like finish college, and it's too late for me to go back. So these are funds that are not scholarship, they're not tuition, they're not loan forgiveness. These are things that will help people get back and finish the programs that they started applying for, especially in the community colleges. So things like that, where how do we ensure that people remain in lifelong learning and higher education, as well as lining up our apprenticeships and other programs with the jobs of the future. So I've got about 4 or 5 bills in this area that I'm looking at.
Obviously, something that AAUW is very interested in. While it's University Women is in our original name, we support education for women at all levels and also support education for men. And I think that this kind of workforce development bill is something that benefits all across the board in our society. So thank you in anticipation for that. Delegate Plum, are there legislative priorities that you're looking forward to?
The list is a lengthy one. It's not one that I personally can take on by myself. We've mentioned many of the things that I'm interested in tonight. And I might say to you that there's a request that we let the new speaker know what committees we want to be on. And when that happened several years ago, and I listed my favorite committee, it was the one he took me off of. So it's now with reluctance that I say to you, I really want to stay on appropriations, but don't tell anybody.
Okay.
So we'll keep it a secret among ourselves.
Well, yeah, it's safe with us.
I know I'm very interested in the budgeting process. I know a whole lot about how it works and how it doesn't work. And I can contribute that knowledge and skills to the body as a whole. I don't expect to get everything I ask for. I'm not naive enough to believe that's true, but I do believe that we can, with some effort, do a better job of prioritizing what we want. And so I'm going to be spending a lot of time, and I will hope to continue on the Joint Legislative Audit Review Commission, because we have a staff of about 30 researchers, nonpartisan, total committed to good government, who do the research for us to lead to good program design and operation. And I want very much to stay involved with that. I was a school administrator for 30 years, and in some regards, I'm still an administrator. I could talk as much about administering programs as I can about legislating about them. And that has influenced my efforts here. There's an effort on the part of the Democratic side to kind of get our ducks in a row to figure out what are going to be our priorities across the board. Because the board, as you've heard tonight, is a broad one, and how it is that we can make choices among them. Just to give you a case in point, we haven't mentioned public safety really at all, but public safety is a big issue. In the budgeting committee, I'm going to be working on continued funding for better training for our police. Unfortunate accidents across our country indicate to us that we don't really do a good job of picking and training people to be on our police force. And it's too dangerous for that to happen, because any one of our families could become a victim of someone who is not trained professionally to be in a police service area. My bill to provide for universal background checks for gun purchases. Remember how many years we talked about that? Hope you all didn't miss the fact that 2 years ago we passed it. We have a universal background check bill now. You know what? Probably there's a legislator, not obviously on this program, but a legislator who's going to put in a bill to scale that back, or maybe even eliminate it. So there I'm going to be fighting again for a bill that I fought for before, but it's important enough to continue to do that. I don't want us to seem like we are somehow unprepared. The fact of the matter is we're prepared on many fronts, and we're willing to spend the time necessary to go forward with these. And I have had the honor and pleasure of working with many advocacy groups over the years to not only work with them on what their goals are, but how they might accomplish their goals. I sometimes tell people, I'm the last guy you want me to introduce to a bill, because sometimes people who look at my name on a bill know automatically probably one of those radical kind of bills that Plum has come up with, and maybe we want to have someone downstate introduce it. Again, it's a matter of not seeking the credit, but to seeking to get the job done. And so that's the emphasis I want to put on. And again, I have the greatest respect for those of you who are on the call, the fact that you would set this up to hear us chatter about some of these things, and to be willing over a period of time to join with us to make for a successful session.
Well, thank you. And I think that I also need to express our organization's appreciation to you for the work that you've done on enhancing childcare options and early childhood education, because as we've discovered, especially in the past almost 2 years, these childcare benefits and makes possible women working in jobs that we absolutely need. The professions predominated by women: teaching, nursing, other what have become essential frontline workers who could not be in the workforce without having reliable childcare. So both of you, we certainly appreciate the work that you've done on issues that are very important to women and to all of us. Amy, have we had any more questions?
Well, we have a thank you from Susan Pauley saying she can't thank both of you enough for all you do and for specifically for this evening. And I also wanted to call out to people. There are 2 items in the chat. One is a link to register for the in-person legislators session on January 8th, which is up sort of towards the top of the chat if you want to copy that out. And secondly, there is a link put up by Patrick Henry Library for following the process of bills through the legislature. So both of those are available for your use in the chat. If you want to copy it out, I'd spell it out, but it's too long and I'd lose my place.
Yes, and I believe the January 8th session is in person, and it's the entire Northern Virginia delegation or Fairfax County delegation?
Fairfax County.
Fairfax County delegation, where constituents can come and much like tonight, raise issues of concern to them. While we're talking about links, I'd like to invite everybody to visit the Vienna area AAUW webpage, which is vienna-va.aauw.net. I don't have that.
That's also it's in the chat as well.
It's in the chat. Great. Thank you very much, Amy. As I said, our organization is open to women and men who support the principles of equity in education, economic opportunity, employment. If there are no other questions, I think that we need to let these gentlemen gear up for the work ahead of them. It's going to obviously be a long session. Would either of you like to make a final couple minute statement? Delegate Keam?
Sure. Let me first thank you once again, Laurie and Amy and Deb and everybody else who, I'm sure there's so many other volunteers involved with this, but the Fairfax County Library system as well. To your last point there, Laurie, about the importance of these issues for not just for women, but for all of us. Let me just reflect on something. One thing we didn't talk about tonight is obviously a very dark cloud over our nation right now, which is what the Supreme Court may or may not do in the next 3, 4, 5 months when it comes to women's health care. And I don't know what will happen during the session. I don't know how much debate we'll have on this. It may be a little bit premature just in terms of what we're going to anticipate, but it's an example, a symptom maybe of the fact that the legislature at the national, state, local levels, and in all the power corridors of our country, corporate, private, otherwise, are full of men. And so when you have men deciding everything, they're only looking at things from their own lifestyles, their own perspectives, their own experiences. And so they might think of a woman's healthcare issue as something that's just kind of a side issue, that it's a political thing. I'll just do this because my base requires it, without really thinking about what that means. But let's look at the other side of it. Today, in just about every college campus in America, a majority of students are women. Most colleges, in fact, some of the best colleges in America have an overwhelming majority of women versus men. That means that the workforce of the future, near future, will be a majority women. They may not rise to the highest levels of leadership yet, but at some point they will. But why do we have to wait that long before women are in charge of everything for us to wait for the laws to change? Why can't we, some of the guys like us who are somewhat enlightened on these issues, why can't we carry that burden now? Why can't we do the work now, so that we don't have to have organizations like AUW or NOW or any other organization that stands for women's issues? Why can't guys like us do the work to make sure that there's equity? And so I think that the charge that Delegate Plum and I have in this session and beyond is to make sure that our voices are the voices of equity, and our values are the values that represent not only the current, but the future of Virginia. And the future is of women. And so we're going to do everything we can to ensure that issues that you care about are represented in your General Assembly. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And Delegate Plum, do you have some parting words?
I join Mark in that plea that we stand up in a leadership role and recognize the abilities and potential of all persons, regardless of sex, LGBTQ status, age, whatever, that we take the non-discrimination bill that we passed the previous year and make sure that that's enforced in our state government, in our state institutions, and in fact in our communities. Those were important steps forward to recognize the strength and capabilities of all persons. Beyond that, I want to say to you that during the course of the year, I publish a newsletter each Wednesday morning. I tell people it arrives at 6 o'clock on Wednesday morning. You don't need to set your alarm clock that day. It will arrive in your laptop or computer, as it may be. It's free. You go to kenplum.com. That's my website. And on that website, you can sign up for it. It will have commentary, some of what you've heard tonight. Some of these issues, for those of you who've been reading my newsletter, know that I've been beating on some of these issues for many decades, but I don't give up on them at all. But to the degree that that's informative to you, so will be it. But it also includes a calendar so that people can know, for example, the fact that I was going to be here tonight was in my newsletter that came out last Wednesday, to allow people who are in my district who wanted to join in could do so. It also includes information on latest government programs and services. So I highly recommend, or what I would hope, that people would sign up for my electronic newsletter. Don't worry about it filling up your computer. After you scan it and decide what you want to see or not see, you can just blip it off. You don't have to. I keep an archive, incidentally. If you want to look at a past issue, I'll keep the archive. But you need only to be able to recognize that, because for fundamental to representative government, from my perspective, is that we stay in touch with you, and that's one of the ways we do that. I'm also available to come to community groups and so on. During the COVID time, I prefer doing them by Zoom. I'm pleased to say that the Cub Scouts that I'm planning to talk to tomorrow evening have now switched their meeting to Zoom. I'm glad for that. I think that was more related to the snow than it was COVID, but I'll be working with some Cub Scouts tomorrow evening, and I'm willing to work with adult groups as well. I'm an old government teacher, believe heavily in our democracy, concerned about its future, want to do all I can to keep it healthy, and appreciate all that you all do as well. So again, thank you for having us.
Well, thank you. And gentlemen, thank you both very much for making yourselves available tonight and speaking on all these issues, answering our questions. I want to thank your aides as well, who worked with Amy and Deb in getting this all arranged. And even more importantly, thank you everybody who attended tonight. This has been a really terrific turnout, and very interesting to hear the range of questions. So again, with thanks to Patrick Henry Library and everybody else, we'll say Happy New Year and good night.